Hi, here's part two to the series where we read Early Greek Philosophy by Johnathan Barnes. In this part, we will be discussing Thales, who was the first Western philosopher. So, without further ado, here's the synopsis of Thales. Thales was a practical statesman, and perhaps also a geometer. What he did in philosophy is uncertain. He is said to have argued that magnets have souls, they are alive, and that everything is full of gods. He suggested that the earth floated on a vast waterbed. More famously, he conjectured that everything was made from water, or even that everything is made of water, that water is the material principle, or arche of everything. Whether or not he inquired further into nature, we don't know. Alright, so that's the introduction. Here's the first, here's the fragments. So here's some more background information. Thales, the first of the canonical line of presocratic philosophers, no doubt had his predecessors, and scholars have speculated on the sources and influences behind him. Two variants of influence have been discerned. First, there are native Greek antecedents. Homer's poems, the earliest surviving works of Greek literature, contain occasional references to what were later to be called specific, what were later to become scientific and philosophical topics. The poems presuppose a certain vague conception of the nature and origins of the universe. How could they not? And that conception finds echoes, both verbal and substantial, in pre-Socratic thought, more influential because more explicit was the view of the universe expressed by the 7th century poet Hesiod. A short passage from his Theogony, The Birth of the Gods, merits quotation. Hail, children of Zeus, grant a sweet song, and celebrate the holy race of the immortals who exist forever, those who were born of earth and of starry heaven, and of the dark night, and those the salt sea reared. Tell how first gods and earth came into being, and rivers and the boundless sea with its seething swell, and shining stars and the broad sky above, and tell how they divided their wealth and shared out their honors, and how first they gained Olympus with its many glades. Tell me this, you muses, who have your home on Olympus from the beginning, and tell which of them first came into being. First of all came the chasm, and then wide bosomed earth, the eternal safe seat of all, the immortals who hold the heights of snowy Olympus, and Mercury Tartarus in the recesses of the wide paved land, and Love, who is fairest among the immortal gods, loosener of limbs, by whom all gods and all men find their thoughts and wise counsels overcome in their breasts. From the chasm came black darkness and night, and from night came ether and day, whom she conceived and bore after mingling in love with darkness. Earth bore first, equal to herself, starry heaven, to veil her all about, and there might be an eternal safe seat for the blessed gods. And she gave birth to tall mountains, graceful haunts of the goddesses, of the nymphs who dwell on the wooded mountains. And she also bore the restless deep with its seething swell, sea without the desirable love, and then she lay with heaven and bore deep, pitying ocean, and Coeus and Creus, and Hyperion and Iapetus, and Thea and Rhea, and Right and Memory, and golden crowned Phoebe, and lovely Tethys, and after them the youngest, wily Cronus, was born, the most terrible of her children, and he hated his strong father. That's from Hesiod, from the Theogony, verses 104 to 138. And then we go back to the commentary. All this myth, not science, but it is, as it were, scientific myth. Many of Hesiod's gods are personifications of natural features or phenomena, and in telling the birth of the gods, Hesiod is telling, in picturesque form, the origins of the universe. The Greeks themselves were well aware of this. The Sicilian comic poet Epicharmus, who wrote at the beginning of the 5th century, presents a mock philosophical criticism of Hesiod's story, and a little dialogue observed by Diogenes Laertius. Then here's the play that he wrote. The gods were always there. They were never yet missing. And these things are always there, same and in the same way always. But the chasm is said to have been the first god to be born. How could that be? He had nothing to come from and nowhere to go if he was the first. Then didn't anything come first? No, nor anything second, by Zeus. Of the things we're now talking about, they existed always. That's from the Diogenes Laertius, Lives of the Philosophers. And then here's a story from a later century, also worth retelling. The poet who writes, "First of all came the chasm, and then wide bosom earth, seat of all," refutes himself. For if someone asks him what the chasm came from, he will not be able to answer. Some people say that this is the reason why Epicurus turned to philosophy. But when he was still very young, he asked a schoolmaster who was reading out, "First of all came the chasm," what the chasm came from, if it came first. The schoolmaster replied that it wasn't his job, but the job of the so-called philosophers, to teach that sort of thing. "Well then," said Epicurus, "I must go along with them, if they are the ones who know the truth about the things that exist." That's from Epicurus. In the final book of his Metaphysics, Aristotle discusses the place of the good and the beautiful in this world. Some thinkers, he says, hold that goodness and beauty only make their appearance as the world progresses. This is from Aristotle's Metaphysics. The early poets say something similar insofar as they hold that it is not the first comers, night in heaven, or the chasm or ocean, who rule and hold sway, but Zeus. But they, in fact, say this because their world rulers change. The hybrids among them, who do not say everything in mythical vein, I mean, Pherecydes and some others, do make the first generating principle the best thing. Pherecydes of Cyrus, whom Aristotle here distinguishes from Hesiod and his fellows, is probably dated to this early 6th century BC. He was therefore a contemporary of the first presocratic philosophers. Aristotle's judgment that he was a hybrid, part mythologist and part natural philosopher, is scarcely borne out by the surviving remnants of his writings. Here are the two most philosophical pieces. The book which Pherecydes wrote has been preserved. It begins like this: Zas in time always existed, inserted Kiphony, and Kiphony acquired the name Earth when Zas gave her the earth as a bridal gift. Pherecydes of Cyrus says that Zaz in time and Kiphony existed always as the three first principles, the one before the two I say, and the two after the one. Time from his own seed created fire and air and water. I take this to be the threefold nature of the intelligible. They were divided into 5 nooks, and from them were constituted the rest of the numerous race of the gods, which is called the race of the 5 nooks, meaning perhaps of 5 worlds. The masochists on first principles. And then it goes back to the Barnes. The other reports of Pherecydes' work contain nothing but fanciful mythology. Many of the Greeks themselves believed that philosophy began among the barbarians in Egypt and Persia and Babylonia. They credited the early presocratics with journeys to Egypt and the Near East, and supposed that they returned with philosophy among their souvenirs. It is possible to suppose that there was some intellectual contact between the Greeks and their Eastern neighbors, but in philosophy, or the theoretical approach to science, it is difficult to find a single clear case of influence. It should be said that where some scholars see striking parallels between a Greek and Eastern text, others see no more than superficial coincidence. Here, for what they are worth, are 2 brief passages from Eastern creation stories, one from Babylonia and one from Egypt. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, was probably composed early in the 2nd millennium BC. It begins as follows. Then here's the text of the Babylonian creation myth. When on high the heaven had not been named, from ground below had not been called by name, not by primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Mummu Tiamat, she who bore them all. Their waters commingling as in a single body. No reed hut had been mated, no marsh land had appeared, when no gods of whatever had been brought into being, uncalled by names, their destinies undetermined. Then it was that the gods were formed within them. Lamu and Lahamu were brought forth. By name were they called, before they had grown in age and stature. Enshar and Kishar were formed, surpassing the others. They prolonged the days, added on the years. Anu was their heir, of his father's the rival. Yea, Enshar's firstborn, Anu, was his equal. Anu begot in his image Nunavut. Note: the text is written in Akkadian, and the translation of the lines is in many places uncertain. Of all events, different scholars have produced remarkably different versions. Anu and Nud Imud are the sky and the earth. Apsu and Mumut Tiamat are primordial waters, the fresh waters in the sea. The identities of the other divinities are uncertain. The Egyptian creation myth is known for in a number of variant forms. The following text probably dates from around 2000 BC, and then it quotes the Egyptian text. Sorry, the Egyptian creation myth. I am he who came into being as Khepri. When I had come into being came into being, and all beings came into being after I came into being. Many were the beings which came forth from my mouth, before heaven came into being, before earth came into being, before the ground and creeping things had been created in this place. I put together some of them in Nun, as weary ones, before I could find a place in which I might stand. It seemed advantageous to me, in my heart. I planned with my face, and I made every form when I was alone, before I had spat out what was Shu, before I had sputtered out what was Teftut, and before any other had come into being who could act with me. I planned in my own heart, and there came into being a multitude of forms and beings, forms of children, and the forms of their children. I was the one who copulated with my fist. Pardon language. I masturbated with my hand. Then I spewed with my own mouth. I spat out what was Shu. I sputtered out what was Teftut. It was my father Nun who brought them up. Then Shu and Tefnut brought forth Geb and Nut. Then Geb and Nut brought forth Osiris, Horus, Kenti, and Irti, Seth, Isis, and Nephthys from the body, one of these after another, and they brought forth their multitudes in this land. Khepri the speaker, this is a note by Barnes. Khepri the speaker is the morning sun god. Nun is the primordial water. Shu and Tefnut are the air god and moisture goddess. Geb and Nut are earth and sky. Both the Babylonians and Egyptian stories bear comparison with Hesiod as examples of mythical cosmology. Many scholars compare the stories more directly with Greek philosophy, suggesting, for example, that Thales' ideas about the importance of water may derive from the primordial significance of the Mumu Tiamat and Nun. They may be right, but to me Thales seems to live in a different and more luminous world. And then it goes into the actual fragments. According to Aristotle, Thales of Miletus was founded of natural philosophy. He is dated by the eclipse of the sun, which he allegedly predicted, and which modern astronomers place on 28th of May 585 BC. The other known facts about his life suggest he was born in about 625 BC and died about 545 BC. Simplicius reports that Thales is said to have been the first to introduce the study of nature to the Greeks, although many others preceded him, as Theophrastus himself admits. Yet he so far excelled them as to eclipse all his predecessors. But he is said to have left nothing behind in writing except the so-called nautical astronomy. Then it goes back to Barnes. Their sources ascribe other writings to him, and there were certainly books circulating under his name in antiquity, but it seems most probable that he wrote nothing, or at least nothing which survives even to the time of Aristotle. For our knowledge of his views then will depend entirely on later reports, and those reports must themselves have been based on oral tradition. Thales was not simply or even primarily a philosopher. He was a man of practical wisdom, one of the so-called seven sages of early Greek history, and he was regarded by posterity not only as an original contributor to science and philosophy, but also as an astute statesman. Herodotus, the fifth century historian, tells several stories which illustrate his political sagacity. And then it quotes Herodotus. Useful advice has been given, even before the destruction of Ionia, by Thales, a Milesian whose family originally came from Phoenicia. He urged the Ionians to establish a single council chamber, saying that it should be located in Teos, which was the center of Ionia, and that the other cities should continue to be inhabited, but should be treated as though they were parishes. And then it goes, and then it quotes a different section. When Croesus came to the river Halys, then, according to my account, he crossed his army by way of the exiting bridges, by the way of the existing bridges. According to most of the Greeks, Thales of Miletus crossed the army for him, for it is said that Croesus was at a loss how his army should cross the river, since these bridges did not yet exist at that time, and that Thales, who was in the camp, made the river, which flowed on the left of the army, flow on the right too, and that he did so in the following way. Beginning upstream of the camp, he dug a deep channel, which he drew in the shape of a crescent, so that it ran around the back of where the camp was sited, being diverted from its original course round the channel, and then, having passed the camp, debouched again into its original course. Thus, as soon as the river was divided, it became fordable in both parts. And he also writes, the war between the Lydians and the Persians was equally balanced until the sixth year an engagement took place in which, after the battle had been joined, the day suddenly turned to night. This change in the day had been foretold to the Ionians by Thales Miletus, who had fixed as its term the very year in which it actually occurred. Though modern scholars conjectured that Thales had learned something of Babylonian astronomy, even so, it is generally doubted that he could have actually predicted the eclipse. Of Thales' philosophical scientific doctrines, the most celebrated concerned water. First, he held that the water rests upon water. First he held that the earth rests upon water, a notion which has some Egyptian antecedents. Here in Aristotle's critical report, quote, and this is from Aristotle, some say that the earth rests on water. This is in fact the oldest view that has been transmitted to us. They say that it was advanced by Thales of Miletus, who thought that the earth rests because it can float like a log or something else of that sort. For none of these things can rest on air, but they can rest on water. Still, the same must not hold of the water supporting the earth as holds the earth itself. No, Aristotle is non-committal, some say, and they say. This cautioned approach to Thales. This cautioned approach to Thales is yet more pronounced in the next few passages. In addition, and more strikingly, Thales held that everything was made from water, or that water, in Aristotle's later jargon, was the material principle of the world. Aristotle, again, is our best source. Quote, most of the first philosophers thought that principles in the form of matter were the only principles of all things, for they say that the element in the first principle of the things that exist is that from which they all are, and from which they first come into being, and into which they are finally destroyed, its substance remaining and its properties changing. There must be some nature, either one or more than one, from which the other things come into being, it being preserved. But as the other things, but as to the number and form of this sort of principle, they do not all agree. Thales, the founder of this kind of philosophy, says that it is water. That is why he declares that the earth rests on water. He perhaps came to acquire this belief from seeing that the nourishment of everything is moist and that heat itself comes from this and lives by this. For that, from which anything comes into being is its first principle. He came to his belief, both for this reason and because the seeds of everything have a moist nature, and water is the natural principle of moist things. Back to Barnes. Aristotle elsewhere reports something about Thales' view on the nature of the soul. Then here's some more quotes. Some say that soul is mixed in the whole universe. Perhaps that is why Thales thought that everything was full of gods. And that quotes again, Thales, judging by what they report, seems to have believed that the soul was something which produces motion, inasmuch as he said that the magnet has a soul because it moves iron. Back to Barnes. There is also some evidence that Thales made geometrical discoveries. The source, Proclus, wrote in the 5th century, but he is relying on the work of Eudemus, a pupil of Aristotle. Nonetheless, scholars have been reluctant to credit Eudemus's reports. Here, for what they are worth, are 4 passages in question. They stated that Thales was the first to demonstrate that a circle is bisected by its diameter. We are indebted to old Thales for many discoveries and for this theorem in particular, for he is said to have been the first to have recognized and stated that in every isosceles triangle the angles at the base are equal, and to have called the equal angles similar in the archaic style. This theorem proves that when 2 straight lines intersect with one another, the angles at the vertex are equal, according to Eudemus. It was first discovered by Thales. Eudemus, in his history of geometry, describes this theorem that a pair of triangles with one side and 2 equal triangles are equal to Thales, for he says that he must have made use of it in the procedure by which he is said to have determined the distance of ships at sea. I append part of the discussion of Thales in Diogenes Laertius's Lives of the Philosophers. This is back to Barnes. Sorry. Some of the statements in this discussion are certainly false, and many are at best dubious. It should be read not as a reliable guide to the views of Thales, but rather as a specimen of the sort of material which we now depend on for our knowledge of the philosophy of the presocratics. The passage is a good illustration of the complex and controversial nature of much of our evidence for the presocratics, and it does also contain some important and trustworthy pieces of information. Thales' father, according to Herodotus, Durus, and Democritus, was Exames, and his mother was Cleobulina. From the family of Thales, they are Phoenicians, the most noble of the descendants of Cadmus and Agenor. He was one of the 7 sages, according to Plato, and he was the first to be called a sage during the archonship of Damascus at Athens, at which time, according to Demetrius of Phaleron, in his list of archons, the 7 sages were in fact named. He was enrolled as a citizen at, at Miletus when he came there with Emilius, who had been expelled from Phoenicia, but most authorities say that he was a native of Milesian, of a famous family. After his political activities, he turned to scientific speculation. According to some, he left no writing behind, for the nautical autonomy ascribed to him is said to be by Phocas of Samos. But Callimachus knows him as the discoverer of the Little Bear, and writes as follows in his Iambi, and he is said to have measured out with the little stars of the way by which the Phoenicians sail. According to others, he wrote just 2 works, on the solstice and on the equinox. Footnote: judging by everything else, judging that everything else was unknowable. He is thought by some to have been the first to study astronomy, and to have predicted eclipses of the sun and solstices. As Eudemus says in his History of Astronomy, that is why Xenophanes and Herodotus admire him. Heraclitus and Democritus also give a good report of him. Some, among them the poet Corylus, say that he was also the first to say that souls are immortal. He was the first to discover the period from the one solstice to the next, and the first, according to some, to state that the size of the sun is a 720th part of the solar orbit, just as the size of the moon is a 720th of the lunar orbit. He was the first to call the last day of the month the 30th, and he was the first, according to some, to discourse about nature. Aristotle and Hippias say that he ascribed souls to lifeless things too, taking the magnet and amber as his evidence. Pamphila says that he learned geometry from the Egyptians and was the first to inscribe a right-angled triangle inside a circle, for which he sacrificed an ox. Others, including Polydorus, the calculator, ascribed this to Pythagoras, who developed to their greatest extent the discoveries which Callimachus in his Iambi attributes to Euph- Euphorbus, the Phrygian. For example, scalings and triangles, and what belongs to the study of geometry. He is also thought to have given excellent advice in political affairs. For example, when Croesus sent envoys to the Milesians to make an alliance, he prevented it, and that saved the city when Cyrus came to power. But he himself actually says, as Heraclides recounts, that he lived a solitary life as a private citizen. Some say that he married and had a son. Eusebius, thus others, others that he remained a bachelor, but adopted his sister's son, so that when he was asked why he had no children, he replied, "Because I love children." And they say that when his mother pressed him to marry, he said, "It's too early," and that then, when he had passed his prime and she insisted again, he said, "It's too late." Hieronymus of Rhodes, in his second book of Miscellanies, says that, wanting to show how easy it is to be rich, he foresaw that there was about to be a good crop of olives, hired the olive presses, and made a huge sum of money. He supposed that water was the first principle of all things, and that the world has a soul and a soul of spirits. They say he discovered the seasons of the year and divided it into 365 days. No one taught him, although he went to Egypt and spent time with the priests there. Hieronymus says that he actually measured the pyramids from their shadow, having observed the time when our shadows are the same size as we are. He lived with Thrasybulus, the ruler of Miletus, according to Medes. There is a celebrated story about the tripod which was discovered by the fishermen and sent round to the sages by the people of Miletus. They say that some young men from Ionia brought a net from some Milesian fishermen. When the tripod was fished up, there was a dispute until the Milesians sent to Delphi. The god gave this oracle: "Offspring of Miletus, do you ask Apollo about a tripod? I declared that the tripod belongs to him who is first in wisdom." So they gave it to Thales, but he gave it to one of the other sages, and so it was passed on until it Solon, who said that the god was first in wisdom and sent it to Delphi. There follow a number of different versions of the tripod story. Hermippus, in his Lives, ascribes to Thales what others say of Socrates. He used to say, they report, that he thanked fortune for three things. First, that I am a human and not a beast. Secondly, that I am a man and not a woman. Thirdly, that I am a Greek and not a foreigner. He is said to have been taken from his house by an old woman to look at the stars, and to have fallen into a ditch. When he cried out, the old woman said, "Do you think, Thales, that you will learn what is in the heavens when you cannot see what is in front of your feet?" Timon too knows him as an astronomer and praises him in his Silly in the following words: "Such was Thales of the seven sages, the sage astronomer." Lobon of Argos says that his writings stretched to 200 lines, and that the following epigraph was inscribed on the statue: "This is Thales, whom Ionian Mil- Miletus bred and showered and showed in an astronomer, the highest of all us in wisdom." He adds that his poems include these verses: "It is not many words which sow an intelligent opinion. Search out one wise thing. Choose one good thing, for thus you will stop the ceaseless tongues of babbling men." The following aphorisms are ascribed to him: "Of existing things, God is the oldest, for he is ungenerated. The world is the most beautiful, for it is God's creation. Space is the greatest, for it includes everything. Mind is the swiftest, for it runs through everything. Necessity is the strongest, for it controls everything. Time is the wisest, for it discovers everything." He said that death is no different from life. Then why don't you die? Someone asked him. "Because it makes no difference," he replied. When someone asked him which came first, day or night, he answered, "Night came first, by day." And when someone asked him whether a man can escape the notice of the gods if he does wrong. He replied, not even if he thinks of doing wrong. An adulterer asked him if he should swear that he had not committed adultery. He replied, perjury is no worse than adultery. When asked what is difficult, he said, to know yourself. What is easy, to give advice to someone else. What most pleasant, success. What divine, what has neither beginning nor end. When asked what was the strangest thing he had seen, he said, an old tyrant. How can we bear misfortune more easily, if we see our enemies faring worse? How can we live best and most justly, if we do not ourselves do the things we blame others for doing? Who is happy? One who has a healthy body, a well-stocked soul, and an educable nature. He says that we should remember our friends, both present and absent, that we should not beautify our faces, but by but be beautiful in our practices. Quote, do not be rich by evil means, he says, and let not words estrange you from those who have shared your trust. Expect from your children the same benefits that you gave to your parents. He said that the Nile floods when its streams are checked by the contrary Ethesian winds. Polydorus, in his chronicles, says that he was born on the first year of the 39th Olympiad. He died at the age of 78, or as Socrates says, at 90, for he died in the 58th Olympiad, 548 to 545 BC, having lived during the time of Croesus, whom he undertook to transport across the Halys, well, without a bridge by diverting its course. There were other men called Thales, 5 according to Demetrius of Magnesia in his Homonyms, an orator from Calidus, who had a poor style, painter from Sicyon, of great talent. The third is very early, a contemporary of Hesiod, Homer, and Lycurgus. The fourth is mentioned by Doris in his work on painting. The fifth, more recent and obscure, is mentioned by Dionysius in his critical essays. The sage died of heat and thirst and weakness while watching a gymnastic contest. He was by then an old man. On his tomb it is inscribed, his tomb is small, his frame is heaven high. Behold the grave of the wise and ingenious Thales. In the first book of my epigrams or poems, in all meters, there is an epigraph on him. When once he was watching a gymnastic contest, O Zeus of the sun, you stole Thales the sage from the stadium. I praise you for taking him near to you, for the old man can no longer see the stars from the earth. But the motto, know thyself, in his, though Antes, Antisthenes, in his succession said it was Ephemeros and Chilons uh, appropriated, and thus ends the text on Thales. Thank you for watching. Or sorry, thank you for listening. I'll I'll have a brief commentary in a minute. I just want to say thank you. Thank you again. Please have a good day.